This happened to me when I was a first-year college student at the art college. Being an art student was great. I was exposed to a lot of artists with different styles and techniques. I had a small group of friends and we had a lot in common. We loved to draw, we loved to write stories, and we even attended plays and art fests. One day, we were required to participate in a leadership training seminar. There were activities that included amazing race-like games, getting to know our schoolmates and potential business connections, and even campus explorations. That also meant we would be sleeping at the college for one night. It was quite fun playing the games and doing the activities that the facilitators had planned for us. Finally, it was nighttime, and it was also dinner time. We stayed in room 204 and gathered in a circle to eat our dinner. School meals weren't always so great, so we snuck some fast food to share. As we ate our dinner, we began to tell creepy ghost stories. One of our classmates, whose older sister had gone to college some years back, told the famous story of a student who died 100 years ago and whose body was never found. A long time ago, when the university had been used as a jail for prisoners of war during the war, some of the students had been forcibly drafted as nurses and reserve soldiers. It was a terrible time to be drafted and forced into war, and those who opposed were either arrested or executed on the spot. She began. One of these drafted nurses was a girl who was both lovely and talented. The men liked her for her medical skills, but more so for her youthful and pure body. One fateful night, the men took advantage of her, and when she refused, they took her to a remote spot and executed her. They then hid her body, where, to this day, it remains undiscovered and forgotten. "That's so sad," I said. "So nobody knows where they buried her?" My classmate shook his head. "No one. It's been said that ever since then people see her spirit wandering around one of the colleges, and those who see her tend to feel all sorts of things." I have no idea what sorts of things my classmate was referring to, but I'm assuming it was something unpleasant. We went on to tell more stories. Then we heard the signal for lights out, so we quickly ended our storytelling and got into our sleeping bags to sleep. Probably around 2, maybe 2:45 in the morning, when I started to shiver from the cold. Even if I had a warm blanket around me, it was still very cold. So I woke up and decided to go out of the room to warm up for a bit before going back in. I carefully crossed the floor, making sure not to wake my classmates, and quietly opened the door of room 204. I walked out of the room and felt my body slowly warm up. The college at night looked quite creepy, and there was barely any movement at all, save for the occasional nightly flyers. After completely warming up, I walked back inside the room and crawled back under my sleeping bag, but as soon as I pulled the blankets over, I started feeling cold all over again. It was as if warming myself up was not effective at all. Suddenly, I heard a faint moaning sound in my ear. I started to quiver as I felt colder and colder. My eyes started to wander around the room, and that's when I saw her. I saw the faint figure of a lady, dressed entirely in a dirty grey dress with long, stringy black hair and a pale and gaunt face. Her eyes were completely black and hollowed as she stood in the corner of the room. I watched as she floated across the floor towards the last door. She suddenly stopped, and I quickly covered my face with my blanket, hoping she would not see me. I was too scared to even open one eye to see if she was gone. After what seemed like forever, I finally mustered up the courage to open one eye to see. The lady was gone, and it was morning. I quickly got up and went to join my classmates for breakfast. When they asked me why I woke up so late, I told them what I saw. They were speechless at first, and I could tell some didn't even believe me. Then one of my classmates spoke up. "You saw her too?" "Too?" I asked her if she had also seen the lady. She nodded and said, "I woke up at around 3 to go to the ladies' room. When I was walking across the hallway to the ladies' room, I felt so cold that I ended up shivering. I walked back to room 205 and I saw the lady walk through room 204 and glide across the hallway. I had opened the door and hid under my blanket as I watched her float by the door's windows. I thought I was dreaming at first, but when you said you saw her float out of your room, I knew I wasn't. Neither my classmate nor I could explain what we had seen, and ever since that night, whenever we would have classes in the second floor that ended at night, we would make it a point to automatically leave without looking back. The reason? Because sometimes, when we'd have classes there, be it day or the early hours of night, we'd still feel cold, like that night, and if we heard a soft moan, we'd see her standing in the corner, looking at us with those black, hollowed eyes. That's a sight I don't ever want to see or feel ever again. In the summer of my second year of college, I decided to go on vacation at my aunt's house in the countryside. The place was a beautiful mix of rustic buildings and nature, but with a hint of modern conveniences, such as the occasional convenience store, small restaurants, and clothing and appliance stores. My aunt was more than happy to let me stay for the duration of my vacation, but I decided to just stay for 1 week. I planned to go to the beach next, sort of have a road trip by myself, so I left my car at the auto shop to be worked on. On my 6th day there, I met her. I saw her sitting outside a small cafe sipping lemonade. She noticed me and smiled. I took that as my cue to sit down next to her. "I'm Rose," she said. She had brown hair and soft brown eyes, and she wore a simple white sundress with a matching white straw hat. She was 2 years younger than me and worked in one of the clothing stores. I told her how I was a visiting college student from 3 cities away, and it was my last day in this town. Rose seemed interested in my being a practical foreigner to these parts. We talked for hours. She even ordered some lemonade for me. She told me all about the place and where all the cool hangouts were. I was surprised to hear that the young people would sometimes have raves in the woods at night. "It's one of the few exciting things that happen here about once a month," Rose laughed. "It sounds interesting," I told her. "I'd like to be able to go to one of those with you, but I'm leaving tomorrow." "Well," she smiled at me, "if you like, there's going to be one tomorrow night, at around 9 p.m. If you leave your aunt's house, you could meet me here at 8, and we could go together." I told her that it sounded like a great idea, and that I would go. I stood up to leave when she held me back by the sleeve of my shirt. "Don't tell your aunt where you're going," she said. "It's a secret. We wouldn't want the adults knowing." The following evening, I packed my things and said goodbye to my aunt. I drove to the cafe and ordered food while I waited for Rose. One of the part-time workers there was a young boy of about 13 or 14. Maybe he knows about the rave tonight, I thought. "Hey kid, are you going to the party tonight?" The boy looked at me with a weird look. "What are you talking about?" he replied. Taken aback, I figured that maybe the boy wasn't cool enough to be invited. I picked at my sandwich again until an older teen walked in the cafe. He looked to be about Rose's age, so I decided to ask again. I bought the guy a beer, and when he smiled in appreciation, I sat down with him. "Hey man, do you know of any happenings tonight?" He nodded his head no, and so I decided to ask a different question. "Do you know Rose?" I asked. "Rose? Yeah, I know her. She was a classmate back in elementary." So he knew Rose. I decided to ask more about her. What are her friends like? Friends? She didn't really hang out with anyone at school. I remember she was real quiet when we started high school, then she quit school in our last year. 2 months later, both her parents turned up dead in their homes. They were killed in their house, but whoever did it missed Rose's rooms, so people started saying things. The boy leaned closer to me with a serious look on his face. "Listen, you aren't from around here, so you don't know. I'd stay clear from her if I were you. There are some weird rumors going around about her. Like she's part of a gang or something. I felt myself break out into a cold sweat. I decided to ask the guy if the kids in the area hosted raves in the woods in the outskirts of town. He gave me a worried look. That's not what she told you, was it? The guy stood up to leave and I returned to my other table. Thinking about it, the whole thing seemed pretty sketch. Why didn't I question it before? But maybe I was just paranoid. At close to 8 p.m. I decided to wait in my car, which was parked close to the cafe entrance. Something still made me uneasy, so I decided to hide in the driver's seat, waiting to see if Rose would show up. A few minutes past 8 went by, and I was starting to believe that she forgot about me, or that she stood me up. At around 8:23, I saw a black van pull up by the road. Then I saw a female get out of the car. It was Rose, and she was dressed in a black dress. Other people went down the van, and from what I could see, they were all males, and they were dressed in black hoodies. I saw Rose talk to 3 men, nod her head, and then enter the cafe. After a few seconds, I heard a shout from inside the cafe, and then all the men ran inside. The whole situation was ominous, so I started my car as quietly as I could and drove towards the city without looking back. My aunt called me the following day, worried that I might not have reached home safely. She was anxious because there were reports about missing people in town. I didn't tell my aunt everything, but I was almost sure it was Rose's doing.
I used to work long hours after school just to finish my projects and deadlines. The school building where I stayed at was a large building with 5 floors and a basement. I was a painting major, and most of the time I was given painting projects that would take at least 5 days to finish. And since I couldn't bring them home on account of them being quite big, I decided to work on them at the studio after class. The studios were located at the basement, and to be honest, when it reaches 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the basement looks pretty dark and creepy. Luckily, I had, as a companion, the night guard. Every time I would work on my projects, the night guard would stop by the studio and ask me when I would be done. "You know I can't let students stay behind after 6 p.m., he would say. "I know, but I just need to finish this painting," I would say. "Please, I have a deadline and I can't bring it home." The night guard would often give in, on the condition that I would clean up after myself, which was a fair bargain, so to speak. One day, I was working on a particularly large painting of the building, and the overall landscape surrounding it. When I was told the deadline of this project was in 4 days, I immediately started to prepare for the next 4 days' worth of working after hours. I didn't mind if it meant leaving the school at 8 or even midnight. I had to finish it. The night guard, upon hearing this, promised that he would keep me company throughout the whole endeavor. "It would be nice to have some company while you work," he said. "That way, time flies faster." So, on the first night, I began to work after hours while the guard went about patrolling the building, with only his footsteps echoing throughout the floor. While I was painting, I began to wonder why the night guard would always give in to my working after hours, even if he knew he would be in trouble. Maybe he didn't want to admit it, but he might actually be afraid of the school building itself. After all, not all guards are brave and fearless. I chuckled and went on painting when, all of a sudden, the power went out. I reached for a small flashlight and called for the night guard. I wondered if there was a power outage. I decided to walk and look for the night guard. "Hello? Guard, are you there?" I called in the darkness as I walked down the corridors. I felt completely alone, and quite frankly, terrified in the dark. I couldn't tell where I was going or what I was hearing, if there ever was a sound. Then, I heard the familiar footsteps of the night guard's shoes. I let out a deep sigh and turned around. Thank goodness! I thought for a moment I I stopped mid-sentence as I stared at the shape behind me. It was the night guard. At least, I think it was the night guard. It was tall and pale and almost deathly thin. It wore the night guard's uniform and had a rather long, twisted grin stretched across its paper-white face. It stared at me with its terrifying grimace before hunching over like an animal. Then all of a sudden, it began to crawl towards me. I didn't know what it was, so I began to run as fast as my feet could carry me. I ran all the way up towards the first floor without even looking back. I could still hear its footsteps coming after me. As soon as I saw the main door, I quickly bolted out and ran into another night guard. "Are you all right?" the other guard asked. "What are you doing here at this hour?" I immediately told him that I was working after hours and that the building's night guard allowed me. Then there was a power outage and I tried looking for the night guard. But then something creepy was coming after me and I thought it was the night guard and... "Are you sure you saw a night guard in the building?" the other guard asked. "Yes. I've been working after school on my projects, and the night guard would always be there inside," I said. I could tell there was something odd when he asked that question. "Why?" "I'm the only night guard on duty," the other guard said. "There hasn't been a guard in your building for almost a year now." I couldn't believe what he was saying. But if what he says is true, then who was with me during the times I would stay after hours? Who was my companion while I was painting in the basement? I don't stay beyond 6 p.m. anymore. If I have a deadline, I bring the canvas home, regardless of how big it was or how heavy it was. I didn't want to stay in the studio basements anymore, especially when I look back at the building every time I leave.
My name is Charles and I'm 32 years old. I will be sharing my experience that took place not too long ago, and I'm still facing it. This all started during the lockdown of 2020. Because of the virus that had spread, we weren't allowed to go out unless it was really important, so the streets were mostly empty and the city was mostly dead and quiet. Sometimes, it even felt like I was living alone in the area. You would see a few people around the grocery store, but other than that, they weren't much around. I lived with my wife and a kid. My wife had been sick, as her immune system is not that strong, but I had tried to take care of her the best I could at home during the lockdown. I had brought everything that my wife needed at home, and even had some doctors come and check her condition once in a while. It was nighttime, around 10 p.m. My wife was on the bed in our room, and I was sitting near her, busy on my laptop. I had a presentation to make, and I had to finish it as the deadline was approaching. Suddenly, my alarm started to beep. That's when I knew it was time to give my wife her medicine. I got up, walked over to the table where I had kept all her medicines. I looked over for it, but all I found was empty boxes. That means I need to go and get them from the pharmacy, as they were important. Without a second thought, I told my wife that I will be back, and I told her that I had to get her medicine and made my way out of the house and into the car. I drove over to the nearest pharmacy, but they were out of supply. I drove to multiple pharmacies, and none of them had it. When I checked the last pharmacy, the shopkeeper gave me an address and told me that I'll find it there. It was far, but I still went as there was no other choice. I drove over to the shop. The road was awfully quiet, empty, and not many houses or shops were around. By the time I had reached the pharmacy, it was very dark and quiet. I had managed to get the medicine, and I had bought a lot of them, so I don't need to get them anytime soon. I started to make my way back home. Honestly, I didn't like how quiet it was. It gave me chills. Not too far from the pharmacy, I suddenly had started to feel an eye on me, like someone was watching me. I knew there was no one other than me. Occasionally, 1 or 2 cars passed by. Other than that, it was just an empty road. I decided to speed up as I didn't like being on that road with the feeling of being watched. I sped up a bit, and a minute later, a deer came in front of the car, and before I could stop the car, it hit the deer. When the car finally stopped, I took in a few breaths and realized what I had done. Quickly, I got out of the car and looked around for the deer, and found it dead, laying on the ground, lifeless. I slowly walked towards the deer in case it was alive, but it was dead. Suddenly, I heard some rustling sounds coming from my right, followed by loud, cracking sounds. Quickly, I spun around to see what had made that sound, and the moment I did turn around, I wished that I hadn't. There it was, standing in the dark, illuminated by the headlights of my car. A dark figure, unhumanly tall, eyes glowing red, claws bigger than duck with yellow, shark-like teeth. It just stood there and stared at me with seconds that felt like hours. I screamed and ran as fast as I could towards my car and locked the doors. At that moment, I was so proud of myself for leaving the engine on, because the moment I had hit the race, the creature I could only call demon leaped towards the car, but it was a moment too late. Not daring to look back, I drove at high speed, not caring about a thing, and just wanting to get the hell out of there. And the lockdown had made it worse, as there weren't any people around. I safely made my way home. I would say I was never so glad to be back home as I was that moment. I gave my wife her pills. I decided to keep today's events to myself, as I didn't want my wife to worry. I had decided to never go on that road ever again, especially at the nighttime. I thought it was all over, but I was wrong. At night around 3 a.m., I jolted and woke up, and I heard the same cracking sound again. And there it was, standing in the doorway. If you read this, please help me. I don't know how to make it stop. Make it stop. Make it stop. Make it stop. Anyone, please just make it stop.